From the outside, Claire and Dan appeared to have the kind of marriage people envied. They'd been together for 10 years and married for 7, living in a charming suburban neighborhood. Both had stable jobs, shared a cozy home, and had even discussed starting a family soon. Claire, a brilliant, driven woman in her early 30s, worked in corporate marketing. Dan, a passionate high school teacher, loved the simplicity and honesty of his job. Their lives were steady, rooted in routine, and a solid partnership built on mutual respect and shared dreams. But if you dug just a little deeper, you'd find the cracks beginning to form in their seemingly flawless relationship. It started about 6 months ago. Dan noticed Claire was becoming distant, almost as if she were retreating into a world where he had no place. She'd suddenly become obsessed with her phone, her work hours grew longer, and she took less interest in the small, shared rituals that had once been the heart of their life together. Morning coffees turned into quick goodbyes as she rushed off to the office, and their nightly talks faded into silence. Dan wasn't the type to jump to conclusions, but the shift in Claire was undeniable. When he'd casually asked if something was on her mind, Claire had brushed him off, explaining she was dealing with high-stress campaigns at work. Though he tried to believe her, his instinct whispered that something was off. Her stress was one thing, but this detachment, this almost secretive behavior felt like a stranger's presence in their home. One Saturday afternoon, Dan found himself in the backyard, trying to get lost in his garden, hoping the rhythmic work would clear his mind. But he couldn't shake the unease. Claire had taken up weekend business trips recently, something that hadn't been part of her job until now. Just the previous weekend, she had left for a marketing conference in a nearby city, returning on Sunday evening with barely a word about her trip. Every attempt he'd made to ask her about it was met with short, vague answers that did nothing to ease his mind. It all came to a head one evening when he couldn't stand the tension any longer. Claire had just come home from another late night at work, her eyes tired but her lips carrying a small, secretive smile. She slipped off her heels, placed her bag on the counter, and went straight to the bathroom without a word to Dan. He knew he shouldn't, but the nagging worry got the best of him. He took her phone, just to check the time, he told himself. But a message from an unfamiliar name, LM, popped up on the screen. Last night was unforgettable. Can't stop thinking about it. Dan's stomach twisted. He stood there, frozen, his mind racing as a flood of memories of their recent, quiet, unsettling months hit him like a tidal wave. Could this explain the distance, the secrets, the mysterious weekend trips? Dan felt sick. He dropped the phone back on the counter, hearing Claire's footsteps as she returned. He quickly turned to look at her, but his heart pounded so hard he wondered if she could see right through him. "Everything okay, hun?" she asked, noticing the tension in his face. Dan forced a weak smile, nodding. "Yeah, just tired," he replied, the words feeling like lies. That night, he barely slept. Visions of Claire, this LM person, and the mysterious nights away haunted him, transforming his once comforting home into a prison of questions. He knew he'd have to get to the bottom of it, but the truth was a frightening prospect he wasn't ready to face. Over the next few days, Dan's mind was filled with plans to confront her. Yet, every time he tried, he found himself paralyzed, unsure how to begin or what he'd even say. What if he was wrong? What if this person was just a friend? But deep down, he sensed something more sinister, an intuition born from years of knowing Claire like no one else. He decided he'd need proof before he could confront her. In a strange mix of determination and dread, Dan braced himself for the next time Claire would leave for one of her weekend trips, prepared to discover a truth he might never be able to unsee. The following Friday, Claire announced she'd be going out of town again, leaving for another conference. She seemed calm, her face unreadable, as if everything were as ordinary as ever. But Dan's mind was miles away, wrapped around the text he'd seen and the doubts that had consumed him since. He kept his expression neutral, but his heart pounded as he nodded and told her to have a good time. As she packed her overnight bag, Dan slipped into their home office to put his plan into motion. He had decided to follow her, something he'd never imagined he'd do. It was absurd, uncomfortable, but he needed to know the truth. When Claire left, Dan counted to 10 before he grabbed his keys, slipped on his coat, and got into his car. He was sure to keep a safe distance as he followed her sedan, her silhouette visible through the rear window. His hands gripped the wheel tightly, his nerves fraying with each turn she took. The drive led him out of their quiet suburb and into the city, his anxiety building as she navigated to a part of town they rarely visited. When she finally pulled into the parking lot of a sleek, modern hotel, Dan felt his heart drop. This wasn't the type of place for a professional conference. It was an upscale, intimate setting, perfect for private encounters. He parked a few spots away, watching as she stepped out of her car, her figure wrapped in a long coat, her hair tied back elegantly. She moved with a sense of purpose, her expression distant but determined, as though she'd already made peace with her intentions. Dan barely breathed as he watched her enter the hotel lobby. After a moment's hesitation, he decided to follow. Inside, the lobby buzzed with quiet elegance. People lounged in plush chairs, sipping cocktails, chatting softly. Dan kept his head low, watching as Claire stepped confidently toward the elevators. He waited a few minutes before approaching the front desk, trying to keep his voice steady as he asked, "I'm meeting my wife here. She just went up, but I forgot the room number. Can you check?" The receptionist gave him a sympathetic look and typed quickly. "Claire Hamilton, right?" she asked, glancing at the computer. Dan nodded, his heart pounding. She looked at the screen and gave him the room number, her professional smile not betraying a hint of judgment. He took a deep breath and stepped toward the elevators, a mixture of fear and anger tightening in his chest. When he reached the floor, he felt dizzy, the numbers on the doors blurring as he tried to steady himself. Room 528. He stopped in front of it, his hand hovering over the door, his mind racing. What was he even hoping to find? He steeled himself, preparing to knock, but before he could, he heard laughter. A man's voice mingling with Claire's soft, familiar giggle. Dan felt as though he'd been punched in the gut. The laugh was unmistakable. His suspicions were real. This wasn't a misunderstanding or an innocent trip. It was betrayal, unfolding just inches away. He walked back to the elevators, too numb to react. He didn't trust himself to stay calm if he confronted them now. Instead, he rode the elevator down, his mind spinning with thoughts of what this meant for their marriage, for the life he thought he knew. He reached his car and sat behind the wheel, staring blankly out the windshield, his knuckles white as he gripped the steering wheel. Finally, he drove home in silence, his thoughts churning. This was it. Claire's betrayal was out in the open. He had suspected it for weeks, but seeing it with his own eyes twisted the knife deeper than he could have imagined. But then, as he replayed her actions, something gnawed at him. This affair didn't make sense, not in the usual way. She wasn't the type to take risks, especially not ones this blatant. It was almost as if she wanted him to find out, to catch her. The thought simmered in his mind as he realized something was still missing from the puzzle. That night, he lay in bed, alone in the dark, his mind racing through every memory, every hint he might have overlooked. As he pieced things together, an uneasy thought surfaced. If Claire wanted him to catch her, then there had to be a reason. But what? The next morning, he decided he'd confront her with caution, not giving away what he knew until he was sure. Little did he know that the truth he was about to uncover would turn everything he thought he knew upside down. When Claire returned home Sunday evening, Dan's pulse quickened as he watched her enter, her face calm, almost as if she'd spent a relaxing weekend away. She greeted him with a smile that barely touched her eyes and hung her coat up without so much as a flicker of guilt. "Hey," she said, dropping her bag by the door. "It was such a long drive back. How was your weekend?" He forced himself to play along, trying to keep the edge out of his voice. "Uneventful. Just caught up on a few things around the house." As he watched her settle in, his mind churned with anger and confusion. Part of him wanted to confront her immediately, to demand answers. But the calm, practiced look in her eyes made him stop short. Whatever she was hiding, Claire wasn't planning to give it up easily. They went through the motions that evening, having dinner in near silence, as Dan struggled to keep his emotions in check. His appetite was gone, replaced by a sick knot in his stomach. When Claire finally turned to head upstairs, he followed, knowing it was time. "Claire," he called after her, his voice hard, surprising even himself. She stopped at the base of the stairs, glancing back with raised eyebrows. "Yes?" Dan took a steadying breath. "Who is he?" She paused, her eyes narrowing slightly, a hint of calculation flashing across her face. "What are you talking about?" "Who is he?" he repeated, his tone unwavering. "You spent the weekend with someone. I followed you to that hotel." "I know, Claire." For a moment, a flash of something crossed her face. Maybe fear, maybe relief. But then it vanished, replaced by a mask of indifference. "I don't know what you think you saw, Dan," she said, folding her arms. "But whatever it is, you're wrong." He clenched his fists, feeling his patience snap. "Stop lying to me. I heard you too, Claire. You were laughing with him, right in the room. And I know about the messages. I've seen enough to know you've been hiding things." For a few moments, Claire just stared at him, her eyes cold and guarded. Finally, she sighed, her shoulders sagging slightly. "Fine. You caught me," she said, her voice hollow. "I'm seeing someone else." The words cut deep, but Dan pressed on. "Why? Why do this? And why make it so obvious? Did you want me to find out?" Claire looked at him, and to his surprise, a flicker of something like pity softened her gaze. "Honestly, I'm tired, Dan. I didn't think you'd actually follow me, but I was prepared if you did. I just can't keep pretending anymore." "Pretending?" Dan's voice wavered, a sick feeling creeping into his chest. "Pretending about what?" But before she could answer, a loud knock interrupted them. They both turned, startled, as the knocking turned more insistent. Dan's stomach twisted as he opened the door to find two police officers standing on the porch. "Mr. Hamilton?" one of the officers asked, looking from him to Claire, her face unreadable. "Yes," Dan replied, his voice shaky. "Is your wife home?" "Claire," he began, but she brushed past him, her face suddenly cold and distant. "Good evening, officers," she said smoothly, her tone unsettlingly calm. "I was expecting you." Dan stared at her, his confusion spiraling into panic. "What's going on?" One of the officers looked at him sympathetically. "We're here to speak with your wife about a recent fraud investigation. We'll need to ask you both a few questions." "Fraud investigation?" Dan repeated, dumbfounded. "What does that have to do with Claire?" The officer glanced between them, his expression tight. "It's complicated. Mrs. Hamilton has been implicated in a series of financial scams involving high-level clients at her firm." Dan's mind reeled. The woman he thought he knew, his wife of 10 years, was somehow involved in criminal activity? He glanced over at Claire, whose face remained eerily composed, as if she'd known this was coming. "Dan," she said, her voice low and steady. "I was going to tell you, eventually. But it's better this way." She turned to the officers, giving a resigned nod. "Let's get this over with." The officers motioned for her to follow them, and she stepped forward, leaving Dan standing in stunned silence. He watched her, his mind spinning as he tried to comprehend the depth of her deception. She'd been involved in something far darker than he could have imagined, using her affair as a cover to meet with others involved in a high-stakes fraud scheme. As the officers let her out, Claire paused, looking back at him one last time, her face unreadable. "I'm sorry, Dan," she said softly. "You were never supposed to find out." And with that, she was gone, leaving Dan alone in the quiet, empty house, his life shattered in ways he'd never foreseen. The silence after Claire left was suffocating. Dan stood in their entryway, frozen in place as the reality of what had just happened sank in. His wife, the woman he'd shared a life with for 10 years, had not only been unfaithful, she'd been entangled in some kind of massive fraud scheme, and she hadn't shown a hint of remorse, hadn't tried to explain, hadn't even seemed surprised when the police had shown up to take her away. Dan sank onto the couch, staring blankly at the walls, his mind numb as he replayed her last words. You were never supposed to find out. What did that even mean? Had she been hiding this for years? And if so, what else had she been hiding? He tried to piece things together, to find a way to understand how the woman he thought he knew had transformed into a stranger. Memories flooded his mind, each one casting new doubts on everything he thought had been true. The way her behavior had changed over the last few months, her evasiveness, the mysterious work trips, none of it was random. She'd been pulling away, preparing for something, and he'd been blind to it all. Over the next few days, Dan's life turned into a series of interviews with investigators, lawyers, and eventually Claire's colleagues. From these tense conversations, he slowly began to uncover the truth. Apparently, Claire's position in the marketing firm had granted her access to exclusive, sensitive information about her high-profile clients. For months, she'd been skimming funds from accounts, using dummy accounts and fake invoices. She'd involved a small group of insiders, each playing a specific role to cover their tracks. The scheme was sophisticated, hidden under layers of complex financial jargon and paperwork. Dan could hardly believe it. How had Claire, a woman he'd once considered practical and conservative, gotten wrapped up in something like this? It turned out she hadn't been alone. The man he'd seen her with, the one she'd laughed with in that hotel room, was a key player in the scheme, a financial analyst she'd met through a corporate event a year prior. They had become partners in every sense of the word, conducting clandestine meetings under the guise of work conferences. He was the one who had first introduced her to the scheme, enticing her with promises of financial freedom and the thrill of the forbidden. And Dan, trusting and unsuspecting, had believed every word she'd told him. One evening, as he sat in the empty house, a knock on the door jolted him from his thoughts. It was Claire's lawyer, a reserved but sharp woman, who handed him an envelope. She wanted you to have this, the lawyer said, her face unreadable. Dan stared at the envelope, his hands shaking as he accepted it. After she left, he sat at the kitchen table, staring at the envelope as though it might explode. Inside was a letter in Claire's familiar handwriting. He took a deep breath and began to read. Dan, asterisk, I don't know how to start this, and I can't imagine the anger and hurt you must feel right now. I know I should have told you the truth a long time ago, but I was afraid of losing everything, of ruining the life we'd built together. I didn't want you to be dragged into this, and I hoped that by keeping you in the dark, I could shield you from it all. Dan's eyes narrowed, anger flaring as he read on. You have to understand, I never intended to get involved in anything criminal. It started as something small, something innocent, but then it snowballed. The more I got involved, the harder it was to stop. I told myself I was doing it for us, that we'd have the money to start a family, to finally do all the things we dreamed about. But I was lying to myself. It became about the thrill, the secrecy. I was trapped in a life I couldn't control. Dan could hardly believe what he was reading. She'd rationalized the whole thing, convinced herself that this betrayal was somehow for their future. I know this doesn't excuse what I did, and I'm not asking you to forgive me. All I want is for you to know that I loved you, that I never wanted you to be hurt. This life we built together wasn't a lie, but somewhere along the way, I lost myself. I lost who I was, and I'm so sorry. The letter ended there. No explanations about her accomplices or the extent of the fraud, no plea for redemption. Just that final apology that felt hollow, empty. Dan crumpled the letter in his fist, unable to process the jumble of emotions coursing through him. This woman, who he'd loved and trusted with every fiber of his being, had shattered his life for the sake of thrills and lies. He spent the next few weeks in a daze, going through the motions as he tried to pick up the pieces. Friends and family reached out, offering condolences and support, but he felt like he was living in a fog, his life reduced to an endless loop of questions with no answers. One day, he received a call from an unknown number. The voice on the other end was professional, sharp, and very familiar with Claire's case. "Mr. Hamilton, I'm one of the attorneys representing the firm your wife worked for. I understand this is a difficult time for you, but we need to discuss some complications that have arisen in her case." Dan's heart sank, wondering what more there could be. "What kind of complications?" he asked, his voice weary. There was a pause on the line, followed by a sigh. "It appears that Claire didn't just use the money for herself. She's been funneling funds into a private account under your name." Dan felt his blood run cold. "What? No, I had no idea. I never saw any of this money." "We believe you," the attorney interrupted gently. "But the fact remains that your name is on this account. Legally, this could implicate you if you don't cooperate fully. We'll need access to any financial records or emails you might have, just to ensure there's no further connection." Dan's grip tightened on the phone. Claire hadn't just deceived him. She'd implicated him in her scheme. She'd made sure that if she went down, he'd be dragged along with her. It was a final betrayal, a blow that took what little remained of his shattered trust and ground it into dust. After hanging up, Dan sat in silence, his mind a storm of betrayal and grief. Everything he'd once trusted had been turned against him. The life he'd built, the dreams he'd cherished, had all been manipulated to serve Claire's selfish ambitions. He didn't just feel like he'd lost his wife. He felt like he'd lost a part of himself. And he couldn't shake the nagging thought that there was still something he hadn't discovered, some final truth that would explain everything. He resolved to find it, no matter the cost. In the days that followed, Dan's life became a twisted labyrinth of legal meetings, financial investigations, and relentless attempts to clear his name. Every new detail the investigators uncovered seemed designed to pull him deeper into Claire's web. And though he had proof he'd never accessed the account she'd set up in his name on it alone tied him to her actions in ways he was struggling to untangle. One afternoon, while sorting through a stack of files his attorney had sent him, Dan came across a small notebook Claire had left behind. It was old, filled with her scribbled to-do lists and half-finished sketches, a piece of her from a time before any of this had begun. As he flipped through the pages, something caught his eye. A list of addresses and initials that seemed out of place. Most of them were scribbled out, as though she'd crossed them off after visiting them, but one set of initials remained. LM, the same initials from the messages that had first sparked his suspicions. Dan's pulse quickened. He thought back to the man he'd seen her with at the hotel, the so-called business partner who was more than just a lover. Could he have been LM? And if so, was there a connection between him and these other names? Driven by a need for closure, Dan decided to investigate. He reached out to one of his old friends from college, James, a tech whiz who now ran his own private investigation firm. When Dan explained his situation, James didn't hesitate. "Send me what you have," he said. "Let's see if we can get to the bottom of this." Within days, James had traced the initials and addresses back to an elaborate network of offshore accounts, all linked through a web of dummy corporations, shell companies, and shady associates. An entire operation that Claire had somehow been at the center of, but LM wasn't just a partner in her schemes. He was the mastermind, a shadowy figure who had recruited Claire and others to front his high-stakes fraud empire. When James shared this with Dan, a new anger stirred within him. Claire hadn't just fallen in with a bad crowd. She'd been seduced, manipulated, and ultimately used as a pawn in something far more sinister than he'd imagined. And now, he was left with the pieces of her shattered life. All while, LM remained untouchable, hidden somewhere beyond the reach of the law. One night, Dan couldn't sleep. Restless and consumed by a mix of fury and determination, he decided he had to see her one last time. He needed answers, if only to understand how much of their life together had been real. The next morning, he called her attorney and arranged a visit to the detention center where she was being held. He didn't know what he would say or if she would even agree to see him, but he had to try. When he arrived, the guard led him to a small, cold visiting room with a glass partition. Minutes later, Claire entered, looking thinner, more tired, as if the weight of her choices was finally bearing down on her. She took a seat across from him, and for a moment they simply stared at each other, the silence thick with unspoken words. Dan was the first to break it. "Why, Claire? How could you do this? To me? To us?" She sighed, her gaze dropping to her hands. "I didn't think you'd come." He clenched his fists, fighting the urge to lash out. "I had to. You've ruined my life, dragged me through your mess, and for what? Money? Excitement?" Claire's eyes glistened with unshed tears. "It wasn't supposed to be like this. I didn't start out wanting any of this. But once I met him," she trailed off, her voice barely a whisper. Dan leaned forward, his voice hard. "So, you chose him. You chose the scheme, the thrill, the lies. You threw away everything we had? Everything we could have had?" She looked up at him, her face contorted in regret. "Dan, I know you'll never believe me, but I did love you. I still do. But this was different. It made me feel alive in a way I didn't even know I needed. And once I crossed that line, there was no going back." Dan's hands trembled as he listened, her words slicing into him with each admission. "You could have stopped, Claire. You could have come to me. We could have found a way out together." She shook her head, a bitter smile on her lips. "No, Dan. I was too deep. And LM, he's not the kind of person you walk away from. I was trapped, and dragging you into it was my only way to protect myself." "Protect yourself?" He let out a bitter laugh. "You framed me, Claire. You set up accounts in my name. You weren't protecting me. You were securing your escape." She was silent, her gaze dropping again as the weight of her betrayal settled between them. Finally she spoke, her voice barely audible. "You're right. I was selfish. I was reckless. And now I've lost everything." For a long moment Dan just looked at her, his heart torn between the love he'd once felt and the hatred he now harbored. He'd come here seeking answers, and he'd gotten them. She'd chosen her path, sacrificed him and their life together for fleeting thrills and hollow promises. Dan rose to leave, the hollow ache inside him giving way to a cold sense of finality. As he turned to go, she called out, her voice breaking. "Dan, please." "I'm sorry. I'll never forgive myself." He paused, turning back one last time. "Maybe that's what you deserve, Claire, to live with what you did. But I'm done. I have to move on from this. From you." And with that, he left, feeling the weight of his grief lift with each step, the chains of her betrayal falling away. In the months that followed, Dan started over. He moved to a new city, away from the memories and the haunting reminders of his past life. He spent long days rebuilding, piecing together his life on his own terms. The investigation finally exonerated him. The charges against him dropped as Claire's full complicity was proven in court. The last he heard of her was a brief mention in a news article. She'd taken a plea deal. Her sentence reduced in exchange for testifying against LM. But even as he moved forward, Dan knew that the scars would remain, a silent testament to the life he'd lost and the truth he'd uncovered. And though it was a painful journey, he found a strange comfort in knowing he'd survived, that he'd reclaimed his life from the wreckage she had left behind. In the end, Dan chose not to hate Claire. He chose not to let her betrayal define him. Instead, he held on to the lessons he'd learned, the strength he'd discovered within himself, and the quiet determination to live a life that was true. No lies, no secrets, just the freedom that came from facing his own truth. And as he looked toward the future, he knew that he was finally free.